Hey, welcome there, goats, and welcome to the Goat House YouTube channel for our last sermon that's going to button up the creation myth in the Bible, or in the part of the beginning of Genesis. So if you were following with me, you know that we talked about sacred time, we talked about sacred space, we talked about the masculine and the feminine aspects, and then we talked a little bit too about how they reveal themselves in the scripture through the symbols of both land and water, right? But now we're going to talk about another pattern that is kind of hidden here implicitly through the scripture, but it's an important one. One which I call, or I've heard called, hierarchical patterns, okay? Or the hierarchical structure. So, I think probably the best way to start unfolding this is to kind of explain what a hierarchy is, or how it works, let's say. And probably the best way to, and the most simple way to do that is to explain it by systems that we're already pretty familiar with, right? And these are going to be, I think, probably the most well-known system that most of us are familiar with, or probably is like the military system, okay? So in the military system uses what? It uses ranks, it uses positions, and it does this to create these layers of authority. Now, this is a touchy subject for most of us, me especially, because I've always hated authority figures, if I'm honest. And, most of the people, I'm not saying all of them, that I have personally come across that were in higher positions above me, they always seem to have like a desire for like self-empowerment, something like that. And I know that I'm not alone in that. I mean, most people, I think, struggle in those types of scenarios also. So, with the hierarchical structure, it does sort of produce this it does produce power. It produces a structure that increases power as it rises. But not only does it increase power, but it also increases, or I should say, it creates a judgment. In order to have those layers of ranks, in order to have those discrimination that's in there, you have to kind of identify those layers, and therefore you have to make a judgment on the people or how those layers are set forth, right? So it's kind of one of those necessary, I almost would say necessary evil, but maybe it's not so evil. So hierarchy allows for the emergence of power and judgment, yes, which typically brings with it a negative energy. And if you are anything like me, you probably favor more of the idea behind like revolution, which is what's known to break apart that hierarchy. Since for me personally, I'm far more inclined to want to bring down those in the higher positions of authority, at least those who are abusing that power for their own benefit, right? And give that power to those of us who are lower, probably because, if you're like me, you were often mistreated or abused by the people who were above you. At least or perhaps you just feel that way. Maybe you weren't, but you feel that way. However, this is really not how the proper hierarchical structure is supposed to work. At least it's not really the way that God intended it, right? Because the way that creation itself is laid out is going to show us the fundamental reality of that hierarchical structure, okay? It's going to lay out what that hierarchical structure looks like. And my hope is that understanding the deeper meaning and process of this structure is going to help us take another look at hierarchy, not from a negative perspective, but hopefully from an encouraging perspective. All right? So as we lay this out, it's going to be helpful for us to remember how those masculine and feminine symbols worked, right? So keep in mind that the masculine aspect is what forms from above, and the feminine aspect is what reflects from below, okay? So when we see the pattern of creation, it's actually going to look as if God's creating a sandwich, all right? So you have the top slice of bread, which we would call heaven, and then the lower slice of bread, which is like material reality. Okay? And as we see the days proceeding from days 1 to 6 in Genesis, all right, it's almost as if God's filling in between these two slices of bread and drawing them closer together, right? So you could imagine that drawing these two opposites together, and then with the substance, like that's in the middle, it's suddenly starting to show us what kind of sandwich we have. Okay, it's almost the same. It's weird to say this, but it's kind of like what when you have a father or a parent, you know, a male and a female, and then you end up with a child that's the product of that. What's in the middle, but this is kind of what you see. You see God, you see the masculine, you see the feminine, and then you see this life emerging out from between the two of them. Okay, so it's a sandwich, like that sandwich effect. All right, so just kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. All right, so what we're going to find is that what is above, which is heaven, or the top slice of bread, is what remains invisible. Like you can't see it, right? We can't see it. And then what's below, the material, the lower slice, is what is seen. Like we can see that, but it's, you know, if it's just stuff, you can't identify it. There's no identification. Okay. So this is how creation works. You know, think about when you are trying to create something. All right. You start out with material. There's nothing special about it. All right. You can't call it anything. It's just material. But then let's say you have a vision or an idea, and you take that material and then you start to form it into whatever that vision is. Okay. Now it becomes something. Okay. You can give it a name. You can give it an identity. It is, in some sense, a creation. Your creation. Okay. So you needed these two aspects to come together. Okay. You needed your idea, the vision, which is basically whatever the meaning and the purpose would be. But you also needed that material to bring your vision into light. Okay. To make it into something, to make it a type of reality. All right. So I think it'll be helpful here to actually go into the scripture itself and see how Genesis lays this out. So let's remember again, on the first day we had the light from above, meeting with that dark void below. And this is our first and furthest visual point, if you think about it, like the furthest meaning like the highest or the upper slice, and then the lowest, which would be the lower slice of bread. And then on day 2, we also see this kind of upper and lower thing happening as well, since there is now a firmament that carries upper waters. And of course, we still have those lower waters that are remaining at the bottom. All right. So day 3 was the land and the water. So this, of course, like we had said in the last lecture, the land kind of acts like the upper piece of bread because it's masculine, and then the water that's remaining below the land is still taking the place of our feminine. Okay. But then also on the third day, you have all these vegetation and trees appearing as well, right? And this would be like the product. You know, this would be like when I was talking about the child that's a product of the male and female, right? The vegetation or the life that's coming from these two, it would be a reflection of that, because it's what happens when that land and that water comes together. All of a sudden, you get vegetation. Okay? All right. So, as we go along, this upper and lower pattern, it still continues further into both day 5 and day 6. And when God reveals, and this is going to be, of course, when God reveals the animals. So now we're moving from vegetation, we're moving into the animals, all right? So I'm actually going to read some of this. I want to read some of this to you, all right? It's going to be Genesis 1, 20 through 25. It is a little bit of a longer section of scripture, so I'm sorry about that, but I think it's kind of important to lay this out so you can kind of hear it right there in the scripture itself, how this is kind of coming together. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this. Genesis 1, starting at verse 20. Then God said, let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth, across the face of the firmament and the heavens. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Then God said, Let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts on the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So here, the first thing that we see is that the scripture reveals the creation of animals first by showing the farthest, or what I would say, again, like as the most opposing aspects, right? And the highest is first the birds of the sky. All right, they fly up there, so they're close. They're the closest thing to heaven, if we think about it that way. And then it also showed us the lowest aspect, which was the fish in the sea, right? So, which we can again imagine this: the fish are swimming in that dark void of potential, where the light would be least seen. Okay. So then, just like the other examples, we move in towards the center. And here is mentioned about the beasts of the earth and the cattle. And of course, all the creepy things on the ground, right? Now, I would imagine that even by separating the idea of beasts and cattle is also acting, again, almost like a microcosm of this pattern, all right? So what I would assume is the beasts, well, that would be like the more chaotic, untamable animals, kind of like the lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my, you know. And then cattle being the animal that can be used for the sake of human effort, right? You can domesticate them, you can utilize them, and therefore that gives them utility and brings them closer to having purpose and meaning. So it's drawing up closer to the heavens, let's say, closer to meaning. Okay, then of course we have the final creation of mankind, and here I want to skip to a verse that I want to read, but this one's it's found in Genesis 2, but I think it's a better verse to describe this, and it's much shorter too. So I'm going to read this one, but this one's going to be found in Genesis 2:7. All right, but here it says, the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living thing. All right, so even though this is a short verse, and we could almost look over it as far as like trying to put this pattern together, it's clearly showing the sandwich still in the same way, right? You still have the air from above, right? And we call that spirit. That's the breath of God. You call it heaven, whatever. And then again, it's like that's the invisibleness, that's the intelligibility, that's the idea, that's, it's not yet something that's made into form or something that you could see. All right. And then that is what's blown into the material. So it's blown into the dust, which would be like the lowest form of material. This dust is just kind of sprinkled around. It's like kind of little particles of nothingness, right? All right. And then so here you have it. It's like the air, again, being that highest, coming down to the particles of dust, which is the lowest. So it's the same kind of pattern effect or sandwich effect. All right. Now here's the trick. All right. The point and purpose of this whole thing is found in Genesis 1, verse 26. And here God says, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the lowest, and over the birds of the air, which is the highest, and over the cattle, which is the middle highest, and then over the earth, and over every creepy thing on the earth, which is, of course, the middle lowest." And again, we can see these things are being drawn from above and drawn from below, right? They're towards each other. And then and they meet in the middle, okay? So we can imagine this is like the creation kind of coming into focus, like as if you were focusing in a pair of binoculars, okay? The upper and lower is sort of kind of coming together to make a clear picture, just like you're dialing in to try to get a clear picture on your binoculars, all right? So when God says that he made man in his image and in his likeness, what do you think is the significance of that? All right? The upper to the lower focusing, that the upper trying to focus in on what is lower. What is the meaning of that? Doesn't it appear that God is trying to bring himself into vision, right? So if God is as an invisible entity, intelligibility, it's almost as if he's trying to bring that intelligibility, drawing up material and trying to bring it into some form of focus, okay? It is the strangest thing, though, because we're used to creation, at least from our perspective, happening a little differently. All right. What I mean is that we get a vision of something, we get an idea, and then we bend down the same way that God kind of comes down, but we impose that vision onto the material, and we force the pieces into place, and we make it what we want it to look like, right? So that could be like, I want to make a table. You're going to go down there, you're going to force all the pieces into making a table, or you're going to make a piece of pottery. You're going to make that pottery how you want it to look, all right? So that's more of a materialistic understanding, all right? You're forcing material into an image, all right? Which means that this will only work for material. That kind of forcing is only going to work for material, but it's something like that is not going to work for something like, let's say, consciousness. Okay? Consciousness, or what we would call spirit, kind of has a will of its own in some sense. So it can't be forced into place. I mean, it sort of can be, but that would be in a sense of like fear and manipulation. But the integrity of that structure, of that conscious structure, if it's built out of fear and manipulation, that's not a very solid conscious structure, right? The moment that a person in that state realizes that it doesn't agree with whatever the structure is that it's in, it's going to break free and run away from that, if it can, out of its own willfulness, right? And you can almost think of this as like when we raise children. You can do your best to raise a child and have them grow up in a way in which you think the ideal person should be, right? But that child could change the course of their life at any time, all right? The child is going to become what they wish to become for the most part. And, of course, as parents, we play a huge role in that. I'm not saying that we don't. Culture plays a huge role in that. But it is funny how sometimes being too hard or even too soft can affect people or children or whatever in ways that we don't expect it to, all right? So the creation of life is much different than the mere creation of material, all right? Since spirit moves more authentically and with something like encouragement more than something like fear or force, all right? Fear causes the soul to respond against something, to avoid something, not to become something, right? Encouragement, on the other hand, encouragement is more of a calling. It's more of an invitation. That when we see someone in our life that strikes us with reverence and awe, right? Someone who we just fully respect, they fully grip us, we agree with them. There is a motivation that makes us want to be like them, all right? Something that from that other person, it captures our soul. And once that happens, there's not too much that's going to stop us from wanting to be or creating ourselves to be like that person, all right? And that, when you have that conscious desire to become like that which you revere and that which you're in awe of, that is like an unshakable integrity. Okay, there's not much that's going to disrupt that or stop you from doing that. All right. So I'm going to use an example of how this idea transfers into a hierarchical system and how the upper and lower hierarchical structure is really supposed to work. Okay. So we used the examples of the military earlier when I first started, right? But something that we can all relate to of a hierarchical structure is a company, like working for a large company. So a company started by someone who has a vision, right? That's somebody has to have a vision, and then somebody has to start putting the company into to get it started, to get it moving. And then that person has to arrange all of the lower functions, let's say, in order to make that vision come to life. So now they have whoever is the head of this company, they have to start to hire people to act out all of the lower functions. And so long as everyone shares in the vision and works accordingly to bring that vision to life, at least in the way in which the person intended it to be, then bam, right? The vision is revealed, the company is fulfilling what it's originally was intended to fulfill, and all is well. But now let's take a very large company, okay? The type of company where everyone sort of feels like a number. And I'm sure many of us have been there also. We all know that the vast majority of people in these kinds of environments, they really only kind of show up for work for a paycheck, all right? And therefore could really care less about the vision of the company for the most part. So then when that happens, you'll have these lower positions, I would use like a maintenance or a janitor, not that there's anything wrong with those positions. I've worked those positions. So, but those people really don't have any connection with like the CEO most of the time in a large company. All right. They have no real connection with the vision, with that higher vision that the CEO would have, or somebody else that's high in that company. And therefore, because of that, the people at the bottom are probably going to do the bare minimum that they have to, all right? Which, can, in some circumstances, especially if you really do feel like you're a number and nobody cares, the effort that you're going to put forth is not going to be that good, right? So then let's say a customer shows up and they realize that the poor maintenance guy is not doing a very good job, everything's poorly maintained, and this person complains and they say, I don't want to do business with a company that doesn't seem to care about cleanliness and appearance, right? But I'm sure that the president of that company, his original vision, was definitely not, to reflect uncleanliness and I'm sure he cared a lot about the appearance of his company, all right? So the problem is the vision is lost. His vision's lost because the lower aspects of the maintenance crew there is no longer reflecting what that upper vision was. All right. There's a brokenness. There's a disconnect between the two. Okay. So the lower position must understand and want to embody the upper vision. All right. Which is held all the way up at the top. And if those two work together, right, the vision of the company will be reflected properly, all right? So even though you have those at the top who know more about all the technicalities of the business, and perhaps because of their knowledge and experience, it allows them to accomplish more responsibilities and more vital roles within the company, a proper hierarchical pattern is going to allow for that top to open up to the bottom, okay? And by doing so, now the bottom can aspire, if they want to learn and to work their way up towards the top, And this aspiration gives motivation. And those at the bottom, they're going to be more willing to participate in the whole vision because they have the opportunity to embody it for themselves. All right? So I'm going to share one more example. And this one was actually given to me by my friend Amelia and her husband, Ish. But they reminded me how this pattern shows itself between a parent and a child. Okay, so pretty much all the time. So when a child reaches the age where they are always asking that question, of why this, why that, why. The parent, we obviously have that deeper knowledge of the way of how the world works. Okay, we know oftentimes, sometimes we know what that why is, sometimes not, but we obviously have a much deeper understanding of the world. But then that puts us in this position where we can either lower ourselves to the child and then give them access to what we know, right? And we try to explain things to them, or we can just put up that stop sign and say things like, because I said so, or whatever. You know what I mean? But you can see here how this puts you in a position of both judgment and power as a parent. Since what you know, or whatever your position happens to be, parent, boss, whatever, you have that power and judgment on just how much access those who are below you have, right? It kind of gives you that power and that judgment. All right. This is what power is in some general sense. All right. It means to be in a place that is essentially above others. All right. Whether that is by strength, intelligence, position, and then this naturally allows you to create a barrier between yourself and then them who are lower. All right. Now this is where it gets tricky, because power must be used to stop those who are lower to have the same access as those who are higher. All right. And this is because, you really don't always want those who are lower to have the same access to the things that people who are higher. Okay. And what I mean by that, so imagine that you needed brain surgery, and I could convince you that I took a class on neurology, and I could probably manage doing it for you, like down in the basement of the church or something like that, right? I'm sure you would much rather have a system of well-experienced doctors making that decision, right? And judging whether or not I would be capable of performing your brain surgery or not, all right? So the same goes for dealing with our children. Maybe you don't want to stop their inquisitiveness, but at the same time, you have to draw the line somewhere, right? Like maybe you can choose what book they want to read or what movie to watch from the children's section, but you might not just give them full access to like Netflix or YouTube or something like that because of some of the things that are floating around on there. So even though power and judgment are absolutely necessary for the hierarchical structure to work the way that it's supposed to work, there is, of course, a right way and a wrong way about doing this. And this is a huge part about what the biblical text is trying to show us. All right. So as we get farther into Genesis, I'm going to talk about the fall of mankind, with the fruit, the snake, and all that. And I'm going to touch on when God sent Adam and Eve out of the garden. All right, when he kicked him out. However, as we go into this verse, it's important that we have a healthy understanding of the hierarchical structure, because the whole act of creation, the proper vision of God, which is, of course, heaven to earth, like what we said, coming into focus, is really, it kind of grounds us in a way that we perceive God's character and our spiritual relationship with him. In other words, how we, his creation, are going to end up reflecting him back. Okay? Then we can understand that being in Eden, or being in God's full presence, basically means the same thing as being fully enlightened by God's full understanding. Like reflecting him perfectly, to be in his presence would mean to be on the same ground as he. Or at least not on the same ground as him, but reflecting him perfectly, let's say. All right? Which means that we would know the full measure of how all things should be understood, how all things should be judged, how all things should be acted out. All right? So then if we can look at the exile from the Garden of Eden, right? If we can look at that and why God ended up placing cherubs with the flaming swords to guard it, Perhaps we can better understand how this might be a good example of how power and judgment can be used in a necessary way. All right? So which, in a large respect, I don't think the cherubs are acting much different, guarding Eden, as what the medical society would act if I were to try to perform somebody's brain surgery in my basement. That'd probably lead to a lot of problems for me and for you. So, does the need to block us from positioning ourselves at the highest level of enlightenment show us that God desires to separate himself from us? It doesn't appear to me that this is how spiritual reality seems to work. Nor does it appear that this is what Scripture is really trying to show us either. All right. If we can understand what Scripture is really trying to tell us, we have seen through Genesis that God had already bent down as far as any cosmic bending down could possibly bend. Right. So he came from the highest place, and he came as low as that empty void and darkness. And when he created man, he came from as high as the heavens, and he blew spirit into the lowliness of the dust. Right? Now I'm going to move into the New Testament, and I'm going to bring a little bit of spirit into this message. So the scripture at the end of John chapter 7, and then it moves into chapter 8. It's where the Pharisees bring an adulterous woman into the streets, and they ask Jesus if this adulterous woman should be judged by the law. And therefore, this means basically she's going to be beaten to death by stones, right? And if you read the verse, before Christ even speaks a word, what does he do? He bends down in the dirt in front of him, and he starts to inscribe this mysterious message, right? The scripture never tells us what he's writing, and people have tried to guess, but the fact of it is that it doesn't really matter what he's writing, right? It's more in the sense of seeing what he's doing. It's seeing what he's showing us, all right? It doesn't matter how low you find yourself in life, okay? God can bring life from the dirt. The way up is always available and waiting, right in front of you, always. And we know this because people climb out of the gutters all the time. Okay? If we know how the story goes, Jesus didn't judge the woman like the righteous leaders judged her and wanted him to. Okay? Instead, he said to them, "Let he who has not sinned cast the first stone." Whereas the one who did not sin, that being Christ, had not accused the woman, but instead had given the chance for her to be redeemed. As he said, "Go and sin no more." The journey of life, it can be difficult. And the paths that we must walk have given some of us some bitter circumstances, no doubt. But we are not who we are. We are what we become. Your feet may be dirty. Maybe they've walked down some roads that you'd rather not share, right? And you find yourself hiding the stains from these places that you've been. The disciples too followed Christ up and down mountains, over raging seas, through storms, followed him across the dry, lifeless deserts. And it seems to me it was all necessary. It was all put there for them to see, for them to experience. Because they learned mountains can be climbed, storms can be calmed, deserts can be crossed. It might be that experiencing those low places, experiencing the valleys, are just as important as sitting on the mountaintops. Or maybe you shouldn't even be sitting on a mountaintop if you've never crossed a valley. So there's two paths here then, two kinds of pathology, one of self-righteousness, one of self-pity. The first makes us think of those who sit in those cushy chairs and white suits and call themselves leaders, while they tell those below them to live proper lives. Well, we know full well they've never touched an ounce of dirt in their lives, right? Maybe we should consider ourselves fortunate if we have some dirt beneath our feet. At least we can say that we're real and therefore compassionate. And the surprise here for those who are feeling lowly is that God makes beauty for ashes. Jesus never kept the disciples from getting their feet a little dirty. But what he does do in John 13 is he kneels down before the disciples with a basin of water, and there he washes their feet clean. This is the sovereign essence of God. If you want to reach the top, you must know the bottom. Then you must learn how to climb. Don't get lost on the dirt path. The pain, resentment, feeling of worthlessness, there are paths here that can lead us into the darkest holes and with no end in sight. It is no wonder that many of us feel that we've earned our misery. Sometimes I have. There's no wonder that many of us have a good reason to feel resentment towards the world. And that path, which feeds that fury in us, that is a tempting path. And so you can't see glory if you're not looking for it. You won't find healing if you're convinced that you can't be healed. And your glory looks more like self-pity or blame on all the world, right? But that's not how you become divine. Okay? That's not how you become a champion, a warrior. I think that most of us would agree it's far better to know your illness than to be ill without having a diagnosis, within the true spiritual process. You can have hopes that the healing is real, salvation is real, and the journey is real. By God bending all the way down, he has set before us a ladder, and therefore a way out of the darkness and into the light. He's given us full access, each rung being like a layer of consciousness. Yes, there are coverings that block us, and it might make us feel distant and have a lack of peace. But it is sovereign and it is good that God would place before us discomfort. He is good not to allow us to fall into the illusion that we have reached paradise when we're in fact still wandering in the desert. Wouldn't you rather keep going until you have found a true paradise, rather than settling and thinking that you're already there? Yes, there are coverings that may stop us from feeling instant gratitude, and that it is because there is a truth yet to be discovered. But when that truth is realized, the scales fall from our eyes, and we find ourselves with roots that reach far enough into the dirt that our branches can reach as high as the heavens. This is the hierarchy of the heavens, but for good reason. And though there are levels, just like levels of a company, the Spirit of God is with us. He speaks to us through our consciousness. He speaks to us through our emotions and through our reasoning. All we need are ears to hear and eyes to see. Then the sky is our limit. Who knows how far you can go? How many shackles you can be freed from? How many wounds can be healed? How much you can transform? How divine you can become? The scripture makes this apparently clear, for it is God's full intention that man will once again live in the garden, which means that man will once again experience the full measure of peace and love, and therefore that we will once again reflect the true nature of God. On your journey, I wish you the best. God bless you all, and we'll talk to you next time.